Welcome, everyone. So this is really exciting to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm really excited that you guys signed up for this class. It goes to show, I think, really that many people are interested in music, what this means with the brain, what this means for our bodies, our minds, the environment. And we're certainly going to go over a lot of these topics throughout the 6 weeks together. And certainly, I'm going to be sharing, so as mentioned in the little course description online, I'm going to be sharing a few slides. But then really this course is really to have a conversation, is to have a dialogue with all of you. Many of the things I'm going to be talking about, many of the concepts and ideas I'm going to be bringing up are really conversation starters. As you'll notice when we go through this material, there are actually a lot of unknowns, and a lot of research certainly has been done in the area of music and the brain. However, there are many more questions than answers, and so I really hope that this is going to bring up quite a lot of discussion between us. Let me give a little introduction about myself, because in terms of why I teach this class. So I am a senior lecturer in the Department of Cognitive Science with a joint appointment in the Department of Neurology in the School of Medicine. And one of the courses that I teach is this particular class on music and the brain. During the semester, it's under the title of Topics in Music, Cognition, as well as another class on Introduction to Music, Cognition, and Perception. And one of the reasons why I teach this class is because I actually studied classical piano for many, many years at Peabody Institute. And I also was fascinated, and I have always been fascinated, I continue to be fascinated by the topic of how can we bring together what we understand about the mind-brain to understand music and the arts. So I also, besides having studied classical piano for many, many years, I'm also have studied photography and film and have worked in that area. And so I have always wanted to create a class, which I actually created this class when I was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins. And I created this class to really bring together the information and knowledge I had as an artist, as well as what I had as a cognitive scientist, and what can I do to bring, like how can I merge all of these elements together? And so I created this class to be able to bring to students the understanding from the theories, the questions, the ideas, the concepts from the brain and computational sciences, as well as to merge that with the concepts, the ideas, the theories, the experiences from the arts, the visual and musical arts. And one of the ways in which I begin this class with the undergraduates and graduate students is I say, you know what, let's just listen to some audio samples. And so that's what we're going to do. But I'm going to have us listen to different sound sequences, and I want to hear what you think and believe you're listening to. All right. Any idea what we were listening to? So if you could please use the chat, that would be great. Yeah. So okay, we have here water and scraping of some kind. Water. Okay, wonderful. Any other ideas? A brush against the surface of water, dolphins. Okay, so really an aquatic experience we're having here. Walking in water, phone in a pocket. Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, so let me, before I tell you what that was, let me give you another audio sample here. Does any of you recognized it? Okay, yes, so violin. That was the Kreutzer Sonata from Beethoven. Yes, Beethoven violin and piano sonata. So the reason why I had you listen to that is because actually the first example, and I'm going to repeat it again because now that you have heard this, I want you to hear now back the first example. So any thoughts, ideas, reactions before I tell you what's happening here? And as what I'm seeing on the chat here, yeah, there's rhythm. It's the same piece but played underwater. So the first recording is actually a simulation of what an individual who uses a cochlear implant is hearing when they listen to the Beethoven Sonata. It really goes to show how much we take for granted. One, about our auditory system. Two, it also really underscores how the musical experience is extreme. We really need to be able to understand the range of frequencies, and our auditory system needs to be able to pick up those so that we can then have what we call a musical experience. And then the third point this brings up is that it really goes to show that we have a lot of research still to do to improve on the medical devices for the cochlear implant of these individuals who are born who are hard of hearing, who are born without the possibility to hear, and those individuals who lose hearing later in life. So let me move forward a little bit more into another audio sequence here. Ideas about what that was? From a division, a chanting, didgeridoo, a ship, a bass violin. Yeah, so that was that. Yes, Tuvian throat singing. Excellent. So yes, that is a Mongolian singer, and throat singing is a very particular cultural part of singing, chanting of performed by Mongolians. It is a type of form of musical creation that is very much in tune with nature. So I bring up this example to show that one, music is also very much tied to culture. And that is an element that sometimes many of us don't tend to realize simply because we tend to be enculturated in a specific type of musical group as opposed to really being taught that there are multiple forms of ways of thinking about how the musical experience is experienced. All right, let's hear another sample. Queen of the Night aria, yes, by Mozart. Perfect, so now let's hear this one. Someone whistling it. No, that's actually a type of cockatoo. Again, I love to bring these examples because I love to see people's reactions. It really shows that now this brings up another question. Well, what about animals? Is music purely a human experience? One. Two, if this particular example of a cockatoo imitating our amazing soprano singing the Queen of the Night aria, you know, if this cockatoo is capable of that, then what does this mean in terms of our shared evolutionary history or not between other species, other animals who can actually have a similar type of capacity for musicality? And then another question that comes up is, well, are they really singing as opposed to the human, right? So I'm going to leave that as a ... because we are actually going to address that question in a bit. So the next question, and one that we are going to be entering throughout our conversation, is this question of how does culture actually affect what we mean by what music is? And so now this brings me to our following question here. So what is music? Can we really define what it is, what it means to us? What is this experience? And certainly go ahead and in the chat if you want to start giving some ideas of what you think it is. I'm going to just put a list here of some of what I think are great examples. So we have here some ideas of how we can begin to define music, and I've listed them here. Organized sound, it's some sort of representational or symbolic concept. It's certainly something that's very physical, and many of you have already mentioned that. It's emotional. It's something else that many of you have mentioned. It's culturally dependent, to the examples I gave, and certainly I'm sure how you are thinking about music, you've realized that culture at some level is involved. It's social. It has meaning for us as human beings. It's personal. So some of you may have recognized, and certainly some of you did recognize the different musical examples, and some of you didn't. So personal also means that not only that you are knowledgeable about it, you know what it is, but also it has different meaning for you. It's a full brain experience. So someone is adding here in the chat of, yes, sounds organized by the brain, yes, to make an emotional response. Definitely sound, rhythm, and tone, all of this coming together to express, to be some sort of form of communication that is nonverbal and understood by everyone. And so the reason why I list all of these elements is really to show, and we're going to see by the end of these 6 weeks together, that it really is a full brain experience because it is emotional, because it is physical. It is not just an auditory experience. It is also actually a visual experience. It is a social experience, a cultural experience. And another element here I've entered is the question of perhaps it's something that's essential for survival. Certainly, I think here in Western culture, we tend to think of music as this artistic form that is performed by experts, that happens in a hall, right? That musicians, these experts who are on a stage, they're very far away from us. They're almost untouchable. That's an interesting concept in comparison to, let's say, the pop culture world, where it tends to be, it's not so much about the untouchable individual. It's somebody in which one can be interacting, actually can be dancing and singing and yelling in conjunction with the artist. So we're going to also address those questions of what that means for what music is. And then I give this example here of John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds composition. Some of you may be aware of that composition. I bring it up because it basically is a 3-movement composition of complete silence. And this composition that John Cage wrote in the 1950s was seminal, really, because it addressed the question of what happens if you put that performer, right, who's on stage, arrives at the piano, closes the lid, takes a stopwatch, and puts eventually, because it's 3 different movements, and actually it takes and sits there in complete silence for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, then what else do you hear? And the whole concept was that music, therefore, isn't just what we typically, or what we as Western cultural listeners and individuals, maybe music is something much more. And so those are the questions that we are going to try to address here. And just to pick up also what's happening in the chat here, someone is asking here, is an essential an answer to a different question? Yes, well, it's the answer to the question of what does this mean for our evolutionary history? So why is it that we humans, how did we get to this point that we humans are engaging with music, that we understand music? And what does this mean for the type of music that we create that's different from the type of music, and I'm going to put that in quotes, or the type of communication system other animals create? And then I put a dot here because perhaps music embodies much more. Now, I'm going to continue really quickly here with a few basic definitions. So we're going to actually backtrack a bit, and we're going to exit this concept of what music is. We're going to return to it, and that's certainly the rest of the weeks where we're really going to focus on that. But I do want to mention a little bit about the auditory system. So just real back to basics here. You know, what do we mean when we say auditory stimuli? So basically, this concept that stimuli are created, auditory stimuli are created by objects, which can be human speaking. It can be somebody playing an instrument, creating music. It can be a tree falling in the forest. It can be a car zooming by. The idea is that all of these objects produce changes in pressure in some elastic medium, so in air, and they're ultimately transduced by hair cells in the inner ear. So sound basically means energy things produce when they vibrate. And we know that sound waves lose energy as they travel, so that's why that a sound that's coming from very far, by the time it reaches you, it is heard in very low decibel level. And when we come to asking these questions within music cognition perception, we do need to break down what we mean by, maybe perhaps there are two different ways of thinking about sound. And one of them is the physical process of it. So this idea that it is about producing sound energy that's going to start with, it's going to have a beginning and it's going to have an end, and it's set, and it's basically sending that energy through air. And then the second aspect, which is the one really that we're going to be addressing for the rest of the weeks together, is what do we mean by the psychological process of music? And the psychological process of music is really addressing this question of what is happening here between our ears and our brains during this converting of incoming sound energy, and how does that lead to what we call is a musical experience, what we call is language, what we call is speech, and what we consider as just random noise. Now, just really quick, just so we can see a visual here of what we mean by sound wave versus ocean waves. So ocean waves are the kind here, you can imagine you have a little slinky. And so those are transverse waves. For sound waves, they're called longitudinal waves. And a longitudinal wave basically is saying that particles of medium, so air molecules, move in a single direction, in a parallel direction to the direction the wave moves. And so this little simulation, I hope it works here. So hopefully you can see in that little simulation exactly how it's moving. Another simulation here. So to give you the contrast, so these are ocean waves in comparison to longitudinal waves. Now, moving forward into amplitude and frequency. So I want you just to focus here on looking at 1, 2, 3, and 4, the little diagram, the little image here. And 1 basically is representing a typical sound wave that's vibrating at a particular amplitude. So the amplitude is the height, and frequency, and so amplitude and frequency, which is basically the number of peaks and troughs that occur in a certain amount of time. And so you can see that the image 1 versus 2 versus 3 and versus 4 are drastically different. And in the second one, so here number 2 in red, this has the same frequency as the one in blue right above, but it has twice the amount of amplitude, right? Because it's much higher. So this is going to sound much louder than 1. So it's going to be the same pitch, but much louder. In the image number 3, this one has half the frequency of 2 right above, but the same amplitude. So this one is going to be a much lower pitched sound. And it's going to be just about as loud as 2, but much louder than 1. And then finally, the fourth example is showing that this has twice the frequency of 1 and 2, 4 times the frequency of 3 right above. So this one is going to be much higher in pitch. And so it has the same amplitudes as waves 2 and 3, but it's going to be just about as loud. Okay, so this is just to show you that from the physical standpoint, it's really important to, I like to show images of this because I think many times, we can hear these sounds, but we can also see them physically, what they look like. We can then merge together what that means, and then how is our auditory system actually dealing with this? So here's an image of the ear. And it's fundamental, again, we really, really need to understand this, because remember that example I gave you of the first one, and everybody thought it was underwater, and then we heard the Beethoven, and then when I told you that it was a simulation from a cochlear implant, it's fundamental to really understand how the ear works before we can go and talk about how the brain is actually interpreting all of this information. So in this image, we see that the ear is broken down into 3 parts. We have the outer ear, middle ear, and the inner ear. The outer ear here, the pinna, what we know is the earlobe, and the concha is this part right here, right as you enter into the ear canal. And this is the outer ear. The middle ear includes these little ossicles, so these little auditory bones. And then the inner ear is this entire area of what we call the cochlea. And I'm going to show you actually a little video of this. But before I do, I just want to give you some facts, which I think are fascinating to walk through. So does anybody know any ideas for why we have this little funky pinna-shaped structure? Any ideas? So the reason why we have it, literally, this is what allows us to focus sound. So in other words, why do we have this as opposed to just having a hole, right, that goes directly inward? So this helps to funnel sound. The ear canal here is about 3 centimeters long. The little ossicles here, the auditory bones, they are actually the smallest bones in our body. The cochlea, which I'm going to explain this in a little bit, is about the size of a little green pea. And the temporal bone, so if you feel behind your ear, you're going to feel your temporal bone. That is the densest, the hardest bone in our body. So, I mean, so this, again, I like to just put these facts because it really, again, we take advantage, really, until we lose capacity of any one of these parts, or, something for whatever reason occurs that we no longer have any of these parts working. They're fundamental, really, to the entire experience of listening, of hearing, and therefore music. Just another interesting element here. So the Etruscan tube here, it has 3 main roles. You know what, I'm gonna put this here. 3 main roles. So one, the purpose of it is to ventilate the middle ear space. So the middle ear pressure actually equals the ambient air pressure. This is going to be fundamental for, when you get into the airplane and you ascend, right? And then you have to yawn or chew on something so that you get that popping sound. The idea is that because the pressure inside is very different from the pressure inside. Also, this Etruscan tube is very important for draining accumulated secretions, for infection, dermis from the middle ear space. And then finally, it's also very important for protecting the middle ear from reflux of nasopharyngeal secretions and bacteria. So the reason why I mention all of this, another element I do want to mention is the tympanic membrane, or the eardrum. We have earwax. We know about this. So, and that's very important actually to protect the eardrum. And I mention all of these little elements simply because, again, not only do we take advantage of this, but it can show you that you can actually begin to have hearing loss any part of the element here. So any of the 3 areas here of the ear, you can actually begin to have hearing loss when any one of these parts is not functioning properly. Here's a diagram of the ear, the airplane ear. So this is just to show, I love this diagram from the Mayo Clinic. So just to show that, when you're in ascent or you're in descent, you have here the air pressure that's entering into the ear canal is very different. So it's higher than what's internally. And then as you're further descending, or when you're during the ascent, it gets much, much more in comparison to the middle ear pressure that begins to increase. The eardrum is beginning to bulge. You need to start swallowing or yawning or chewing on gum so that you can eventually have equalized ear pressure. And so that's when you hear the popping sound. Now I'm going to go ahead and share a video because this is a great explanation of how, once we've entered into the cochlea, how this is actually breaking down what we mean by frequencies. So,
the outer ear catches the waves, which then travel through a narrow passageway called the ear canal. The sound waves reach the eardrum, which is a membrane roughly half the size of a dime. They make the eardrum vibrate, which in turn vibrates 3 tiny bones called the malleus, incus, and stapes. These bones amplify or increase the sound vibrations and send them to the cochlea. The cochlea is shaped like a snail and is the size of a garden pea. It is filled with fluid, and the sound vibrations make this fluid ripple, which creates waves. Hair-like structures called stereocilia sit on top of hair cells and are grouped together as hair cell bundles inside the cochlea. The hair cells inside the cochlea ride these waves, and the hair bundles are moved. The hair bundle on top of the hair cell turns these movements into electrical signals. As the hair bundles are moved, ions rush into the top of the hair cells, causing the release of chemicals at the bottom of the hair cells. The chemicals bind to the auditory nerve cells and create an electrical signal, which travels along the auditory nerve to the brain. Different hair cells respond to different frequencies of sound. The hair cells at the base of the cochlea detect higher-pitched sounds, such as a piccolo or flute. The hair cells toward the top of the spiral detect progressively lower-pitched sounds, such as a trumpet or trombone. At the very top or apex of the spiral, the hair cells detect the lowest-pitched sounds, such as a tuba. The auditory nerve carries the electrical signal to the brain, which interprets the messages as sounds that we recognize.
Certainly, we completely take for granted that little structure of the cochlea. And so let me go back to the slides here, because I'm going to break down that a little bit more. All right, so in this cochlea, as we heard, this is an example of, imagine as if you could take the cochlea and just spread it out. And so that's exactly what the video was talking about in terms of the distribution of the frequencies along the cochlea. And just another little more facts here. Humans, we are most sensitive from 20 to 20,000 hertz. And most sensitive we perceive is the 1,000 to 5,000 hertz. And so that is where speech tends to lie around. With respect to the little hair cells that we saw in the video, these are basically what we call the receptive cells of the inner ear. And we have approximately 12,000 outer hair cells and 3,500 inner hair cells. Keep this as a note, because if these are damaged, or so let's say you have normal hearing and you go through life, or something happens in which these get damaged, they cannot regrow. You know whose hair cells can actually regrow? Birds. So they actually regrow for avian species. Ours do not. So once they are damaged, they are permanently damaged. So I mentioned the birds because not only, and we're going to address in terms of what type of communication they have, but this is actually becoming a really fascinating area for research in terms of really wanting to understand at the biochemical, at the physical, mechanical engineering perspective as to how can we learn and understand better how and why avian hair cells regenerate, and how can we then bring that into come up with therapies or some sort of stem cell type of work. How can we do this for humans as well? So different frequencies of vibration produce particular patterns of maximal vibration. And one of the there are several theories. I'm not going to go into them simply because they're very complex and due to issues of time. But just one theory I'm going to throw out there is this, what we call the place theory. So the place theory says exactly what we heard in the video and what I've mentioned here, in which we have what's called a tonotopic map. And in this tonotopic map, the cochlea shows basically a very orderly map of frequencies along its length. So the apex responds best, it's most sensitive to high frequencies, and the base responds best, most sensitive to low frequencies. So what this means is that if any part throughout that little cochlea, any part of these frequencies, any part of it is damaged, you're going to have problems hearing. And so this brings me to the issue of what this means for the cochlear implant individual. And The cochlear implant individual is the case where it's either someone who has been born with this particular hearing deficit and requires this medical device, and or it can refer to individuals who later in life or due to disease or accident or whatever other reason completely lose their hearing. And so this is something that you need to go to the doctor and needs to be surgically implanted. And just to briefly walk through the various parts of this cochlea, and I actually wrote down the descriptions of what it does. So I'm going to start here with part 1. So this is the microphone. It basically picks up sound energy. Here, what sits behind the ear is the little sound speech processor, as it's known, and it basically filters and analyzes and converts sound energy into a digital code. This other part here is the battery. This means you can actually turn it on or off. I have gone to conferences where there's a whole section on understanding how children who have cochlear implants, and understanding how we can teach them musical experiences and what this means for improving their language capabilities. And children, I've noticed, tend to really have fun playing with their device and taking a humorous approach to their lack of hearing by saying, like, you know, guess what? I can turn off my device. I don't have to listen to you. You can say whatever you want. You can yell at me, and I don't care because I don't have to listen to you. So that's the part in which they're referring to. Number 3 here, so this is the part that you can really see. Maybe you've seen individuals and you know somebody who has a cochlear implant. So part 3, it's basically a coil here that sits right above, and it transmits the digitized information that's coming from the internal receiver stimulator. And that takes us to part 4 here. So that's the internal part. So it's magnetized. So that's what gets surgically implanted. And this internal magnet has an antenna and it's a receiver. And so this decodes incoming signal and it sends information to each frequency band to a different electrode. So we move forward to 5 here. So that's where we have the electrode array inside the cochlea. And this electrode array basically receives the signal distributed by an internal receiver. And then it's this particular array that is going to electrically stimulate the auditory nerve fibers. And that is directly going to then be understood by the brain. So this is an example of the case where hearing loss is outside of the brain, is due to a factor outside of the brain. So with these individuals, their brains are perfectly intact and there's nothing abnormal about their brain. And so it's literally here, it starts at the cochlea, the problem with the cochlea. This does not mean that hearing problems can occur in the brain. They most certainly can. Individuals with cochlear implants certainly are not having a musical experience. And however, they still are capable of perceiving rhythm. So if we backtrack to that question I asked you, so what is music? One of the ways we can define music, we can think about it, is that it's simply a pattern of different pitches, right, in a particular sequence, in an ordered sequence that have meaning, right? And meaning can basically be broken down into emotion, cultural, and so forth and so on. And so what this means for cochlear implants, and what it means also for our understanding of what, even how we can begin to define music, or what this means for research in this domain, is that we really need to understand then how are we really, when we say, and in the video, the first video we saw, when they say, okay, how do we interpret, we interpret the sound into music, what do we really mean by interpretation? And so that is the big question we're actually going to address the rest of the class, is really trying to break down exactly how does the mind-brain interpret this information and come out with the experience of music. Now I'm just going to show you another slide here. This is just, I think this is a great map to show that the frequency range for music is very different from the frequency range for speech. Cochlear implant users actually are very good with speech. If you know somebody with a cochlear implant, you may actually not even realize that they have one. Their speech is excellent. And so as you can see here, it is much more reduced in terms of the number of frequencies in which we use speech. And music has a bigger range. And so if the problem is that you cannot identify different frequencies, then most certainly you're not going to be able to have a musical experience. Just a little more information about hearing loss. It can occur basically due to loud noise. The number one cause of hearing loss is loud noise. So when it's above 85 decibels, it can be temporary or permanent. So in the case in which, let's say you go to a really loud concert, right? And you hear that, you sort of hear those high-pitched noises way in the back, but you can't really hear things afterwards for a long period, or maybe not a long, for like a day. And then the next day you're totally fine. So that would be a temporary situation as opposed to a permanent long-term problem. Loud noise is particularly harmful to the cochlea, so it does damage the cells and the membranes in the cochlea. Another interesting fact here, about 30 to 50% of hair cells can be damaged or destroyed before you even realize that you have hearing loss. However, by the time hearing loss is noticed, your hair cells basically have been destroyed, again, about 50%, in which they cannot be repaired. And we're not like birds, so we cannot regenerate them. Hair cells bend more if the sound is louder, and so they become straight again after they recover. So remember in the first video we saw, so they're basically moving back and forth. So they become permanently dense when they completely move forward, and they simply, I mean, there's been so much exposure to so much loud noise, it can no longer return back to their original state. Noise can actually also damage the auditory nerve, so not just necessarily in the little hair cells within the cochlea. And presbycusis is the formal term that refers to age-related hearing loss, and that basically just refers to living life, right? So it's the result of acute or sustained exposure to very loud noise. Here's an image of the normal hair cell versus the damaged hair cell. So that's what we mean by the normal in their normal bundled state. You can see this, I think it's a very powerful image as opposed to after noise. See how they are kind of in all directions and completely bended over. And they're pretty much completely destroyed. So that is an example of the type of destruction that occur because of loud noise. Just so you get a sense of what we mean by above the 85 decibels. So your refrigerator humming sound is about 45 decibels. Heavy city traffic, 85 decibels. So you can imagine, yes, if somebody is in heavy traffic every day for many hours of their life, across their lifespan, that can yield a problem later. Motorcycle, 90 decibels. Firearms, 150 decibels. So that's why those individuals who go to firing ranges have to wear protective gear, as well as the individuals, you know, who are in the airports, right, who are doing checking for the pilots, right? So when they can move, they are wearing sound canceling earphones because those are up there, right there with firearms. And of course, everything really depends on how close you are to the sound source and the length of time. So I don't want anybody to leave here worried that you're going to lose your hearing, you know, if you hear a siren pass by, and, you know, no, it's really about how, I mean, literally the siren have to be right there next to you and consistently for it to be full on hearing loss. This is just a great diagram, I think, really to show you how now we move up towards the brain. So we've been just focusing right now at the very basic level in terms of here the cochlea. So right as soon as we exit the auditory nerve, these are just the different parts of the brain, from the superior olivary complex, nucleus, lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus, thalamus, all the way up to the auditory cortex. So it has to go through all of the lower parts of the brain all the way up to the main auditory cortex area, which is right here, what we call the temporal lobe of the brain. And so again, I show this diagram to show you that there's really a whole entire journey, really, in which all this information is being processed. And it also goes to show that there could be a problem due to, let's say, stroke or disease, in which any part here around the pathway could be damaged, and therefore hearing loss could occur at some level. So this would be called brain-based hearing loss. Here's just another image to show you how it looks like if we're looking from behind. If you were to be able to look inside the brain. Going back to this tonotopic map, it's really fascinating. So remember, we saw that if you were to open up the cochlea, right, you can spread it out. You see all the different frequencies laid out, the basilar membrane. Well, guess what? If we go to this is the temporal lobe. So we have what's called the primary auditory cortex and the secondary auditory cortex. So in the primary auditory cortex, this tonotopic map is actually across the primary auditory cortex. So you can see here that this part corresponds to the apex of the cochlea, the lower frequencies, to the higher frequencies at the base of the cochlea. So this is mapped out along the primary cortex. So just moving on to now our final slides here. A little more about the auditory areas in the cortex. So of course, now we have to start talking about, as we enter into higher parts of the brain, we have to start talking about what we call hierarchical processing that's occurring in the cortex. And so what's really interesting here is that neural signals actually travel through the core. So this core area is auditory cortex 1, also known as the core auditory area, followed by the parabelt area, so this other area. So once it gets processed in the auditory cortex 1, then it moves to the parabelt auditory cortex 2. And so this means that simple sounds are activated in the core area, and then further processing occurs as it enters into the belt and parabelt areas. And so this is now going to respond to more complex stimuli that are made up now of multiple frequencies, right? So we saw the tonotopic map in the core part here. So we have them segregated out, the different frequencies. And so that information is further then going to be processed in a more complex way into here, this part of the secondary auditory cortex. And so this is important to know because then all of this information is then going to go to higher parts of the brain, in which we're then going to be able to process this as music versus speech or other noises. Another interesting part of this entire concept of what we mean by hearing, we have what is called the what and where streams of hearing. So the what stream is what we call the ventral stream. The where stream is called the dorsal stream. And the what stream starts at the anterior portion here, so the front part of the core and the belt, and extends to the prefrontal cortex. And we're going to talk a lot about this, especially when we enter into creativity and processing of that. And so this is really important for identifying sounds. And the where stream, it starts in the posterior part, to the back side of the core and the parietal, and the belt, sorry. And so it's going to extend into the parietal cortex. So this is parietal cortex. Auditory cortex is in the temporal lobe. And all of this is then going to feed to the prefrontal cortex, and that is responsible for locating sounds. So you can imagine that somebody could have, let's say, a stroke in which the where stream pathway gets affected. And so they have problem actually locating, being able to identify where sound comes from, but they can still identify what the sound is, or vice versa. And we know this from evidence from neural recordings and as well as from brain damage situations and from the brain scans of those individuals. And then finally, the question of sound location. You may have noticed, it may be intuitive at this point, hopefully, sound is most accurate when it's directly, you can figure out what it is and where it's located if it's directly in front of you. It's least accurate if it's behind you. And it's also in terms of whether it's coming from one side more than from the other side. Literally, your head is in the way, so sound has to travel around your head. But that becomes really important to understanding where sound is, precisely because you can identify through intensity of decibels and that interaural time difference from when it finally gets to your left ear, that you can identify, oh, the sound is coming from my right, or it's coming from my left, or it's coming from right in front of me, or right above or below me. And then finally, really the auditory experience is what we call a multisensory experience. So we have really briefly, very quickly, just sort of brushed through the very basics of sound processing. And the rest of the weeks, we're really going to try to break down. And well, then how do we know it's music, right? From everything we listen to, as opposed to speech, as opposed to random sounds, any other type of sound, an object. And so this is what we call as scene analysis and auditory scene analysis, which basically is the concept of analyzing how we mix all these sounds together and how we arrive to understanding what they are. All right. So we are actually right a minute before our class is up. What I'm going to do is, there's a fun, really nice reading. It's a summary, really, of what music perception in the brain, what are the big questions addressed, that Oliver Sacks wrote, a really nice summary. I'm going to share that with you so you have it and you can have a little more background to really what we're going to be talking about in the next couple of weeks. Okay? All right, so thank you everyone for listening. Some really fascinating ideas and concepts coming over here. So, okay, great. Have a wonderful rest of the week, and I will see you next Friday.